Hello, my name is Vincent Covello, and I'd like to share with you information about nonverbal communications. In other segments, we've talked about messaging and verbal communication, but as you may have heard before, we're not just what we say, but also what we look like and what we sound like when we say it, which is, of course, is nonverbal communications. One of the things that we know from the research on nonverbal communications is that what you look like and what you sound like can be more important than the words you speak. In fact, there's a significant amount of evidence now that in high-stress, high-concern situations, as much as 75% of information is coming from the nonverbal cues as opposed to the verbal cues. We also know that nonverbal communication, because it's a visual, is more memorable than words. It often goes into the very basic visual parts of the brain, the lizard brain, the amygdala, etc., and therefore tends to be more memorable and stays with us. It's part of the visual context for understanding a risk or an emergency. They often receive much more attention. In fact, in low-stress situations, people generally don't pay much attention to nonverbal communication, but in high stress, it's like a hawk. They're watching each and every aspect of the nonverbal communication as a way by which to determine how significant the threat is, should they be concerned or not concerned, and using the body language of the spokesperson as a way by which to make determination. And finally, and perhaps most interestingly from the research, is that in high-stress situations, people tend to focus on the negative interpretation of a nonverbal cue. Nonverbal communication gestures, for example, hands, posture, eyes, carry with them different charges. You could argue they have a positive charge, a neutral charge, and a negative charge. In low-stress situations, people tend to focus on the positive meaning of the nonverbal, or the neutral meaning. If you're sitting back in your chair, it's because you're comfortable, or it's just simply you're contouring neutral. You're contouring yourself to the shape of the chair. But in high-stress situations, the research shows that people tend to focus on the negative meaning. So your back in the chair posture indicates lack of concern, lack of caring, lack of listening, indifference to the issue itself. It's one of the reasons why you often will see individuals communicating a high concern situation leaning slightly forward. Often my wife even says when I argue with her about a high concern issue, when I lean slightly forward, that I'm assuming the crisis communication position. In terms of body language, another thing we should be sensitive to is that gestures are, for the most part, culturally conditioned. In fact, I'm only aware of only one universal body language or body gesture, which is smiling, and even there you may have multiple interpretations. In Western European culture, we tend to focus, and this comes from retina studies, etc., on the eyes, which are part of the larger facial expression. We know, for example, there are 82 muscles in the face that affect even such things as smiling. Second, we look at people's posture. How are they sitting? How are they holding themselves? Third, we're looking at their hands. There's over 400 different gestures in Western European culture by which we can now communicate with our hands, let alone our arms. And finally, people will look at the dress, the overall appearance. What are we telling a person by how we're dressed, by jewelry, other aspects of dress and appearance. And finally, probably the most complicated is the voice. The voice in many ways is like an instrument. It can communicate all the basic emotions in the same way that an instrument can. Eyes, in terms of what we want to do, is maintain eye contact. Too much eye contact would be staring. Too little eye contact indicates lack of attention to the issue, lack of concern. In fact, in Western European culture, eyes are the single most important way by which we judge trust and credibility. That's not necessarily true in other cultures. For example, Aboriginal cultures, many Aboriginal cultures do not, for example, put a high premium on eyes. It's, in fact, among the least important, in fact, even sometimes offensive to look at a person's eyes, because it's looking into their interior soul, stealing their soul, etc. Second, we look at posture. Ideally, we want a slight lean forward. That means in speaking about a high-stress issue. Keep in mind, again, in low stress, it doesn't matter that much. But in high stress, you want to lean slightly forward, have a rounded position that indicates relaxed as opposed to tight and rigid. Hands, ideally the hands should be at waist level. A big gesture simply don't work in these types of situations, except if you're doing a speech, let's say, in front of a large audience. But even then, it can work against you because of the negative interpretation that's associated with virtually any of the body language that we use. We want to keep our hands in small motions and even expose the palms. I have a colleague who does research that indicates that when you can't see the palms of a hand, that it makes people nervous. Some of the hormones and other things that run through our blood tend to be activated when we can't see the palm of our hands. Many of the greetings that we use by which to meet people, such as a handshake, a bear hug, a salute, are ways to indicate that the hands are empty. Again, this goes back to the perhaps to the most primitive ancestors, where a person might be carrying a weapon in their hands. And finally, arms slightly rounded, so that again we come across as relaxed and casual. Voice tends to be, as I mentioned before, probably the single most complicated. In fact, recent research being done in Scotland even indicates that the single word hello and how you say hello can be used as a means by which people decide fundamental things such as are you trusted, are you likable. A study was done for over 300 people who didn't know each other, who listened to 65 people saying the word hello, and virtually every person in the study identified the same personality characteristics of the individual speaking, that they were trustworthy or not trustworthy, likable, not likable, competent, not competent, etc. And voice has many characteristics. It has everything from hesitations to pitch. You'd want to keep it a minimum, the ums and the ahs, because they work against you in a high-stress situation. Speed. The average person speaks about 3 words per second. In a low-stress situation, again, it's just part of your dialect. In a high-stress situation, it might indicate nervousness or stress. You can emphasize certain words. You could have a monotone of variations so that people don't get bored. Incomplete sentences, phrasing, and even the vocal and facial expressions will contribute very much to how we interpret the voice. Ways to improve your nonverbal skills. Unfortunately, looking in the mirror is not going to be very helpful. We see ourselves too much in the mirror and become accustomed. So therefore, one of the things you can do is to ask a friend to evaluate your nonverbal communication. But even in a high-stress situation, have them, for example, bring up a high-stress controversial issue where you might have some disagreement and videotape it, or at least give you feedback. This could be a friend, a coworker, or even a family member. You want them particularly to look for any nervous motions. You don't want to hold anything in your hand that looks like you're nervous, that might even be used as a weapon. You want to keep your hands empty, and again, small motions, and anything that indicates nervousness, such as repetitive gestures, can indicate stress, and the person will become concerned about why are you stressed about the issue itself. I'm stressed enough. We want to do role plays. Again, videotape is extremely helpful in this regard. We can experiment this by doing various types of expressions. And finally, you might want to smile more often, but keep in mind that a too large a smile can be misinterpreted. As opposed to something friendly, it could be interpreted that you're not taking the issue seriously. In general, I should mention that humor is not a very effective device in high-stress, high-concern, risk and crisis situations, and therefore anything that implies that you're taking it humorously would be inappropriate. You want to write down your initial impressions of people and just start reading people's nonverbal communication. You might want to take a look, for example, at the pictures that are included in Professor Ekman's works. He wrote 2 classic textbooks on nonverbal communication. The first is called Emotions Revealed, where he provides you a large number of pictures of what the different emotions look like and how it affects the facial muscles and other parts of the body. His even more interesting book is called, it deals with lying. It talks about what happens to the face, to the eyes, to the way we hold ourselves when we're lying. And again, you might want to take, his name is Professor Paul Ekman from the University of California. Watch TV with the sound off. Just start reading people's nonverbal communication as a way by which to become sensitive to how people communicate nonverbally, and then incorporate that into your own repertoire. And finally, look for discrepancies between nonverbal and verbal communication. I mentioned earlier that people put more emphasis on the nonverbal communication, so therefore you want to look for when a person says, I'm telling you the truth, but there are indicators in terms of eyes, hands, posture, etc., that they're not telling you the truth. Look for those type of discrepancies, and particularly you might want to, again, go back to Professor Ekman, who talks about those discrepancies in great detail. Active listening is part of nonverbal communication. It's one of the ways we show people that we care, that we're listening, that we're attentive to what they have to say. There's a very large literature on active listening. It includes everything from giving feedback to people, paraphrasing what they have to do, but also includes the nonverbal communications, nodding your head, a slight lean forward, good eye contact. I'd strongly suggest, especially for face-to-face communication, that you both learn as well as practice your active listening skills. Active listening, again, to more in detail, these are just some of the elements you'll find in active listening: paraphrasing, providing feeling words, the body language that indicates that you're attentive, voice, supportive voice qualities, word emphasis, phrases, and emotions behind the words. If you'd like more information about nonverbal communication, as with other segments, I strongly encourage you to do more reading, especially about the research on nonverbal communication. I particularly would focus your attention on the Drexel Library on Risk and Crisis Communication. And with that, I'd like to thank you.